thank you for joining me for the Clockworks Academy lecture on Frankenstein. It is April 1st, 2019, and I've titled this lecture, It's a Movie! It's a Movie! You know, like, it's alive, it's alive. Anyway, this is both a standalone class on the 1931 Frankenstein movie and also week 9 of an 8-week-long course on Frankenstein. The previous 8 weeks have been focused on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the book. If you'd like to find out more, I'm barely going to talk about the book today. But if you'd like to spend 8 weeks with me digging into Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the text of the book, check out Clockworks Academy, clockworksacademy.com. I am starting a new session of this Frankenstein course on April 15th. If you happen to be watching this video after April 15th, go to clockworksacademy.com and find out when the next session is starting. It will be starting again eventually. I am also on April 15th starting an 8-week course on Bram Stoker's Dracula, if you'd prefer to take that, or if you'd like to take both, and there are other courses coming too. Check it all out. I'm Dr. Paul Moffat. That's me. I'm wearing a doctor hat because I have a PhD in literature, not in film, so this is going to be a literary perspective on Frankenstein the movie. Our agenda for today's class, I'll start by talking a bit about adaptation in theory. I'll talk a little bit about monsters in theory. Then we'll really get into the movie Frankenstein, and my approach to talking about the movie Frankenstein is mostly going to be through questions. Questions about the movie, and some suggested answers. So before we get into Frankenstein specifically, let's talk a little bit about adaptation. You know, the movie we're talking about today is the 1931 Frankenstein adaptation. What does it mean that it's an adaptation? How does adaptation work in the first place, and how should we think about it? Or another way of putting that question, how does one text turn into another text? And I want to pause just for a moment on that word text. You may be wondering, how do you figure a movie is a text? What exactly is a text? In an academic literary perspective, we say text to mean anything that can be read with layers of interpretation. Think texture. Something that can be read with texture is a text. And so it has to do with not just what the object physically is, but also how we approach it. I could read the microphone I'm talking into right now as a text if I start looking into the interpretive layers required to understand it, right? So it's all about layers of interpretation. A movie is a text. A movie is a text. It doesn't have to be written down to be a text. So back to the question, how does one text turn into another text? There are a lot of complex and nuanced answers to this question, but for today's class, I want to focus on one particular vein, and it starts with a philosopher named Walter Benjamin. This is him. He wrote an essay called The Task of the Translator. I'm quoting it out of this book, volume 1 of his selected writings. Benjamin said, "The concept of life is given its due only if everything that has a history of its own, not merely the setting for history, is credited with life." Benjamin is not talking metaphorically here. For Benjamin, the point that he's making is, life is more than biological. Things are alive if they have their own history. And specifically, he's talking about art. Art is alive. And then he goes on about what that means, and we're not going to right now. I recommend reading it. I recommend reading all of Benjamin, actually. He is pretty fantastic. But Linda Hutcheon, Canadian literary critic and literary theorist, there she is, she picks up on this idea, this Benjaminian idea of art being alive in her book, A Theory of Adaptation, which this is the second edition. You can find that and buy it, and I really recommend it. It's a great accessible and really readable introduction to the idea of adaptation theory. I'm actually quoting from the first edition, which looks like this. One of my favorite of her conclusions in her book, near the end, she says, "Adaptation is how stories evolve and mutate to fit new times and different places." Now, Hutcheon is talking about art being alive much more metaphorically than Benjamin is, but the idea here that adaptations, says Hutcheon, aren't parasites. We imagine them sometimes that way. We talk about them sometimes as if they're sucking the life out of the original, as if there's a competition between the original and the adaptation. And we also talk about adaptation with language of fidelity. Is it faithful to the original? Linda Hutcheon says none of that is useful. None of that is helpful for understanding and appreciating adaptations as adaptations. Instead, adaptations don't suck the life out of their ancestors. They are like biological adaptations. They're how stories evolve and mutate to fit new times and different places. And so what makes a good adaptation is how well it thrives in its new environment. What makes an adaptation bad isn't whether it's faithful or not to the original, it's whether it thrives in the new environment. And what thrives is what the story carries on into the future. So as I talk about Frankenstein today, I'm going to be talking about things that are changed from the book. The point of emphasizing things that are changed from the book is not to say, oh, this is where James Whale, the director of this movie, got things wrong because it's not faithful. One of the things that's most revealing about an adaptation are the changes, because they're the things that mutated for a new environment. They're the things that are revealing of something that the original wasn't revealing. Right? So I want to keep that in mind. As I talk about adaptation, I'll focus on some things that are different from the book. That's not a value judgment one way or the other. It's noticing how this text has mutated, how this story has mutated for a new environment. Let's talk just a little bit about monsters and the idea of monsters in general. Monster comes to English from the Latin monstrare, which means to show. That's where also we get the English word demonstrate. You see the word monster in demonstrate. The point of that is that monsters show. So what exactly do they show? 3 things I'll suggest. First, monsters show fears. They both reflect the particular fears of the particular era or society or culture out of which and into which they are written. So, the 1931 Frankenstein film is both reflective of particular fears that were being felt by all the people involved in making it, but also it resonated with the fears of the people who were watching it, otherwise it wouldn't have been popular. Right? The reason it was so popular is whether they were able to articulate it or not, people recognized and shared or responded to the fears that the monster is dramatizing. Monster stories also reflect and dramatize universal fears. Universal, haha, get it? Because Universal is the studio that made the movie. No, that's not what I mean. Universal fears aren't necessarily, I don't really want to say that they're universally held by all people, but they're common fears of the human condition. The most compelling and engaging monster stories, the more commonly held these fears are, not just within a particular time and place, but by all people everywhere, the more compelling and engaging the monster is. That's always necessarily going to be a scale, but the more lasting monsters are monsters that appeal to more widely held and common fears of the human condition. So when we talk about the particular fears of a particular age, all the ways that Frankenstein's monster in the 1931 movie are different from Frankenstein's monster in the 1818 book show the differences, the adaptations, how stories evolve and mutate to fit new times and different places. All the ways that they're different show the ways that the specific fears of those two contexts are different from each other. 2, going right hand in hand with those fears are desires. Monster stories are cautionary tales. Fears arise from desire in complex ways, but to boil it down a little bit, fears arise from desire in at least 3 ways, right? The first is we have a desire and we have fear of not getting what we desire. So monster stories show us things that might get in the way of our desires, and so fear and desire are connected to each other in that way. But also, we have fear of getting what we desire. So monster stories demonstrate things that we want and then caution us what happens if you get what you want. They're stories that are ways of dramatizing how we disallow ourselves to pursue all of our desires. And those desires become monstrous because we want something and then we create ways to stop ourselves from getting it for all kinds of psychological and societal reasons. And then tied to that is the idea that desire and fear are always inherently linked to each other. And so are desire and disgust, by the way. Disgust is the flip side of desire. We feel disgust as a mechanism of coping with desires for things that on a different level we feel we should not desire. And so the emotional response to protect us from our desire is fear and disgust. Monster stories embody those desires as much as they embody fears. That is why you get sexy vampires. That's why you get people on Twitter talking about being attracted to venom, right? Because fear and desire are tied to each other. And third, monster stories are about boundaries. They're about the boundary lines of humanity. And specifically, what monster stories do is they show us the two sides. On one side, we have everything that's human, and the way that we understand what is human is by drawing boundary lines. The way that we decide what is a group, not just a group of human. Boundary lines, border lines, are how we define the shape of things. And we define the shape of things by excluding everything that doesn't count as part of this shape. So monster stories help us define the other. And in general, groups define themselves against the other. They each perceive each other as the other with a capital O. And that's how you delineate and understand who you are, by defining who you're not. And then as long as we're talking about things on the right side of the boundary line, we know who we have to care about, who we have to protect, who we have responsibilities to, and who we don't, who we have to persecute and alienate and cast out. So let's actually get into Frankenstein. I want to start by talking a little bit about film and Frankenstein. One of the things that this movie does with Frankenstein's monster, and by the way, in the book you may have heard, actually Frankenstein is the scientist's name. In the book that's true, and there's I could go on about that, but in the movie, the creature is explicitly called Frankenstein.
Take care there, Frankenstein, take care.
That's also true, by the way, of the play upon which this movie is based. The play by Peggy Webber that this movie is based on is arguably the origin of the creature being called Frankenstein. It's the first time that the creature is explicitly named Frankenstein. So, I'm going to try to be clear and call the Frankenstein's monster when I'm talking about the monster, but if I call it Frankenstein, know that for the context of the movie, that's just as accurate as calling it Frankenstein's monster. So one of the other things that this movie introduces is the idea that the monster is stitched together. In the book, Frankenstein, who's telling the story, is very carefully and deliberately vague about exactly how he makes the monster. But it's pretty clear that in the book he does not just take, a hand, an arm, a foot, and stitch them together. He's like making it from the tendons and bones, like from that level. He's sculpting it together like clay. In the movie, it's explicitly stitches.
No blood, no decay, just a few stitches.
Entire pieces stitched together. That is fitting for a movie because a movie itself is stitched together. And I mean that both literally, as in, not literally with stitches, but the way that film is put together into a movie is pieces of film are stuck next to each other. That's not true of how books are written. It's not true of how plays exist as pieces that were once separate, that someone puts right next to each other so that it presents as if it's a whole. But it's definitely true of film. Pieces assembled in the order by the editor create the final film. Also, though, metaphorically, this film and films in general, but let's talk about this film, is stitched together. I mentioned a second ago that it's based on a play by Peggy Webber. So we have, and let's look at the credits. This movie is directed by James Whale from a screenplay by Garrett Fort and Francis Edward Farrago. But their screenplay is based upon a composition by John L. Balderston. So Balderston wrote a story of Frankenstein that Garrett Fort and Francis Edwards Farrago adapted into the screenplay for this movie, that then James Whale adapted the screenplay into what we see on screen. And in fact, I said James Whale, but he's the director. But of course, Boris Karloff, Colin Clive, May Clark, John Bowles all adapted the screenplay and James Whale's direction into a performance. And then James Whale adapted the performance into a final product that we watch. And in terms of the creature, Boris Karloff plays the creature, but the creature is also created by makeup artist Jack Pierce. And arguably, the makeup on the creature is as significant as Boris Karloff's performance. Arguably even more so. I wouldn't say so. In fact, I would say once they start putting that makeup on other actors in the third sequel, the fourth Frankenstein movie, the creature's not as good with the same makeup but a different performer. But my point here is not to parse whose contribution is more significant and more important, but to say that what we get on screen is stitched together. Jack Pierce puts makeup on Boris Karloff, and the two of them spend hours talking about the characterization of the creature and how he should move and what he should be like. And then Boris Karloff gives a performance based on the script written by Farrago and Fort, based on the story written by John Balderson, based on the play written by
Peggy Webling,
based on the book written by Mary Shelley, which is then taken by James Whale and adapted into the movie that we see. And it is not unique by any means for this movie. This is the nature of film. It's stitched together. So it makes a lot of sense that whereas the creature in the novel, exactly how he's put together is not the point, and there's a very central sense in the novel of one genius is responsible for this creature who's a new thing. In the movie, Frankenstein stitches him together from parts, and the responsibility for creating him is diffused. So Henry Frankenstein says, I made him with my own two hands, but Fritz, as his assistant, helps him. Fritz is responsible for some of the central aspects of the creature, including his abnormal brain, and we'll get to that later. And then he has this audience while he's bringing the monster to life.
Quite a good scene, isn't it? One man crazy, three very sane spectators.
In the novel, Frankenstein is alone. It's important to the meaning of the novel that he's alone. But it's important that Henry Frankenstein is not alone. This isn't a sole creation. It's stitched together with collaborators and from parts, as film itself is. And when we talk about this as a movie that's stitched together, I haven't even talked about the influence. There have been a number of plays and movies of Frankenstein before this one, including one by Thomas Edison, actually. That is to say, produced by Thomas Edison, directed by J. Cyril Dawley. But the Edison Frankenstein isn't even my point. I said the screenplay to this movie is based on the play by Peggy Webber. It is equally inspired by and influenced by earlier plays. The very first play based on Frankenstein, the novel by Mary Shelley, was from 1823. It was called Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein, written by R.B. Peake. And R.B. Peake's play is the first appearance of Fritz, the assistant. So you can see, and other things too that I'm going to get to in a sec, but you can see that this movie, the Peggy Webber play, is lost. There are no copies findable. Maybe there may be by some people in the universe, but I couldn't, and every place I looked, other people said, we can't find this play, the literature on it. But I don't think Fritz is a character in her play. Fritz is a character in Presumption, but not in the play that this movie is supposedly based on, and not in the novel that the movie is supposedly based on. So it's, again, stitched together. Add to that, this movie is obviously influenced by and inspired by the 1920 German silent film directed by Paul Wegener, Der Golem. Now you may have noticed that the Frankenstein story is similar to the Jewish folktale of the Golem. But there's some question about whether Mary Shelley would have known the Golem. She may have, she may not have. I'm not going to go into it now. James Whale, director of this movie, definitely knew the story of the Golem. And he knew the movie, The Golem, How He Came Into the World, by Paul Wegener. He may have known there's another Golem movie made by Paul Wegener from 1915 that James Whale might have known, but we don't. It's been mostly lost. But the 1920 Golem movie, you can watch on YouTube. It's in public domain. You can see how James Whale's Frankenstein looks like the Golem at some crucial moments. And even the way Boris Karloff moves, his lumbering walk, is really reminiscent of Paul Wegener played the Golem in the movie The Golem. His walk is really reminiscent of Boris Karloff's, because Boris Karloff would have known the Golem. And the two things that I want to draw attention to are silent film and German Expressionism. I'm not going to go hugely into detail on either one of those, except to say German Expressionism is a movement in film, and the hallmarks of German Expressionism are chiaroscuro lighting, which is to say a strong contrast between light and dark, straight lines in the shadows instead of gradual fades, distorted angles is hallmark of German Expressionism, and externalized emotion. So strong emotion that's externalized onto the sets that are sometimes minimalist, sometimes not, sometimes very complex. But in any case, externalizing the emotions of the characters into the set design. You can see, even apart from the way that this movie is directly reminiscent of Der Golem, the influence of German Expressionism on Frankenstein. Stark contrast between light and dark in the lighting, the sometimes bizarre camera angles, but also the way that the sets are evocative of the emotions of the characters. And especially here, the lab, that the complexity and wildness of Henry Frankenstein's emotions. And that's even in the thunderstorm. The thunderstorm that represents the wildness of his emotions is an aspect of German Expressionism, or is a remnant of the ideas of German Expressionism in this movie. The other thing, of course, about Der Golem is that it is a silent film. That brings us to one of the questions about Frankenstein 1931 and a big difference between the movie Frankenstein and book Frankenstein. And that is, in the book, the creature speaks. Doesn't just speak, he speaks at length. Probably, I haven't looked at page numbers, but probably about half of this book is narrated by the creature from his voice. So how do you get from that to a monster who doesn't ever speak? And there's a few answers to that question. And when I say there's a few answers to that question, like all questions of interpretation, it has layers. And like any interpretation of a text, there are layers and texture to the answers. Depending on what we mean by the question, we'll get different answers. So there's a historical answer. And the historical answer is, this is another one of the influences of Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein by R.B. Peake from 1823. That first play of Frankenstein featured a monster who didn't speak. Fritz, the assistant, and the unspeaking monster are both remnants of that very first play of Frankenstein. And the reason that the monster didn't speak in that version is because the laws in London at the time were that plays could only be put on in one of the two theatres in London unless they were musicals or pantomimes. And to be a musical, it had to include original songs, which the 1823 Frankenstein did. I don't know those songs. I haven't. Maybe I should try and see if I can look up the lyrics to them, but I haven't. I don't know them at all. And it also had to include some pantomime, and they included pantomime by having the creature be a pantomime creature. Mary Shelley, by the way, went to that play. It's the only adaptation of Frankenstein that we know that she knew, and she mostly liked it. She especially liked the creature, the non-speaking creature. So, a non-speaking creature goes way back to 1823 as part of the history of Frankenstein. There's also a metatextual answer to why this creature doesn't speak. That is that 1931, when this movie was being made, was very early in talkies, in movies with sound. It wasn't one of the first movies. Like, the first movie was The Jazz Singer from 1927, so it's been a couple of years. But it's still early enough that silent films are being screened at this time. Boris Karloff, like most movie actors in 1931, had been a silent film actor. His first movie was in 1919, and he made dozens of silent films before he made Frankenstein. In fact, Frankenstein was Boris Karloff's 81st movie. So he was a studio actor who'd been in many, many movies, often as a silent film actor. Despite how prolific he was as an actor, he wasn't known, though. He was small parts, right? But so Boris Karloff is a silent film actor, and he's cast in this movie as a silent film character. We can read the creature in the 1931 Frankenstein as silent film existing in the context of a talking film. And he doesn't fit in that context. He can't make sense of it. He can't make himself understood because silent film continues to exist in 1931 and it feels out of place. And that's one of the things that's happening with a silent film monster in a talking film. Add to that, though, there is a symbolic answer to the question of why the creature in this movie doesn't talk. Remember what we said about how monsters represent fears and desires and the boundary line around humanity. If Mary Shelley's monster in the book, his symbolic meaning is about, I'm not going to go into detail about it, but it's about trauma and existential crisis and other stuff too. But it's important to his meaning that he can talk, that he can defend himself, that he can present his perspective, and then all he is capable of doing is presenting it as eloquently as he can and hoping that people accept it. And part of what makes the pathos of the book is that he presents his perspective and it gets rejected anyway. The movie's doing something different. The movie Frankenstein is not about that existential dread in the same way. It's about alienation and isolation. The creature doesn't speak because he can't. There is an existential dread, I suppose, but a different sort of existential dread. Our sympathies for a lot of the movie are with the creature, despite the fact that he's monstrous, despite the fact that he's a murderer. And why our sympathies are with him are partly Boris Karloff's performance is so full of pathos. But it's also tied to the very fact that we can't hear his perspective. Boris Karloff plays him as if he has a whole depth of emotion, and the direction, full of close-ups on Boris Karloff's face, emphasizes the creature as an emotionally complex and nuanced being. But then because he doesn't have a voice, he can't express that to anyone in the movie. And one of the central things that the movie's about then is his isolation and his alienation and his inability to connect with anyone around him. Everything that the creature does in the book should be able to persuade people, but it doesn't because people aren't receptive. But the movie creature can't speak, can't express the complexity of his emotions to anyone. And we, the viewers, recognize it, but none of the characters really do. And then, of course, there is what I would call the least satisfying answer to a question of why the creature doesn't speak, and that's the in-world answer. The creature doesn't speak because
he's only a few days old, remember.
The timeline of the movie is far contracted from the timeline of the book, where the creature has years to learn to speak, to learn to think and read and do all the things when he reconfronts Frankenstein. Just for clarity, I'm stumbling sometimes over using Frankenstein's first name. That's because the names are also stitched together and like they put all the names in a blender. Because in the book, Frankenstein is Victor Frankenstein, and his best friend is Henry Clerval, and there's another character who's framed by the creature whose name is Justine Moritz. But in the movie, Frankenstein is Henry Frankenstein instead of Victor Frankenstein, and his friend, instead of being Henry Clerval, is Victor, and is Victor Moritz, and there is no Justine Moritz. So there are names from the book, but not attached to the people that they're attached to in the book. We could speculate all we want about why they do that, but maybe I should say this outright so that I can be more clear. If I'm talking about Victor Frankenstein, that's a book character. If I'm talking about Henry Frankenstein, that's a movie character. If I ever, I don't think I will, but if I ever talk about Henry Clerval, that's a book character, roughly, very roughly, the equivalent of Victor Moritz, who's the movie character. All right, so we're clear on that. Henry Frankenstein says it's been only a couple of days since he made the creature. His brain hasn't developed yet. And the secondary reason in the movie for the fact that the creature can't speak is that he has an abnormal brain. Now, there's nothing about an abnormal brain in the book. Everything in this movie about him carrying something from the person that he used to be, about the parts being defective, none of that's in the book at all. So the question is, why does the monster have an abnormal brain? As before, there are a number of ways of answering this question depending on how we want to ask it. I'm going to skip most of them. I mean, the in-world reason is because Fritz drops the normal brain. But I'm much more interested in the symbolic meaning. That is, why is the choice made in this movie to give the monster an abnormal brain rather than say nothing about it? In the book, Victor presumably makes the brain himself, as he makes everything himself, from raw materials somehow that's not specified. In the movie, the monster is given the entire brain that used to belong to a human. And having made that choice, why an abnormal brain? Here I think we come back to the way that the fears of a particular society are represented by the monster stories that it tells. In the book, one of the central story elements is that Victor Frankenstein abandons his creature. And throughout the entire narrative, one of the central ideas is the creature malevolent by his nature, or because he's unhappy and misery leads to wickedness? The book asks that question and ultimately avoids answering it, but many readers of the book, including myself, think that the book leans more towards misery as the source of wickedness rather than it being inherent to the creature. The movie gives a lot less ambiguity about this question. The movie gives us built in and answers the question before the monster is even made. Look at what Waldman says about the brain.
Here we have one of the most perfect specimens of the human brain that has ever come to my attention at the university. And here the abnormal brain of the typical criminal. Observe, ladies and gentlemen, the scarcity of convolutions on the frontal lobe as compared to that of the normal brain, and the distinct degeneration of the middle frontal lobe. All of these degenerate characteristics check amazingly with the case history of the dead man before us, whose life was one of brutality, of violence and murder.
So the monster's abnormal brain is both an answer to why he can't speak, why he can't communicate, because there's something wrong with him, there's something wrong with the raw materials. And it's also an answer to where vice comes from. In the logic of the movie, wickedness, vice, evil is inherent in the monster, is built into his biology. He has a bad brain. That's what makes him bad. The criminal who was dead, whose brain it was brutal and vicious and violent because his brain was made wrong. And it's not about society. It's not about how he's treated. It's not about how his parenting. It's about how he was born. It's about how he was made, what he's made out of. In other words, in the movie Frankenstein, wickedness, evil, is in the body. And that brings us to the idea of disability in this movie. And there's more we could say. I'm going to treat this topic quite briefly. But I want to draw attention to the way that Fritz, the hunchbacked assistant to Henry Frankenstein, his body is connected to incompetence and cowardliness and stupidity. He's a comic relief character, but all of his, like the moment when he drops the brain, for example, because of his body, he bangs against the table and is startled. It's a mix of his disability, his cowardliness, and then his foolishness that he takes the other brain instead. Those are all directly tied to his physicality, to the state of his body. And then that Fritz is the one who antagonizes the creature to the point of the creature, both by bringing in the torch, which sets the creature off to violence, and then later by whipping him and tormenting him more with the torch. Fritz's antagonism towards the creature is an expression of hierarchy of power and disability. Fritz's body is a barrier to his full integration into the society of Henry and Victor and Elizabeth and Waldman. He is an outsider to that by virtue of his body, and that's symbolized at the moment when he's looking through the window at the whole classroom that Waldman is teaching. They're all these able-bodied people inside the classroom, and he's coded disabled. I mean, I keep saying disabled, disability. It's a longer conversation, but his hunchbackedness is a sign of and code for bodily deformity and disability in kind of a vague way, right? So he's on the outside looking in at this community, and then when the creature is made, the monster is also abnormal in his body and brain and is lower down, and so there's this antagonism that Fritz asserts power by diminishing the creature in the same way that Henry Frankenstein has asserted his power by diminishing Fritz.
Fool. If this storm develops as I hope, you'll have plenty to be afraid of before the night's over. Go on, fix the electrodes.
But at the same time, both Fritz and the creature and the location of their character flaws in their bodies is, especially with the monster, I call it the creature. In the book, I always called it the creature when I was discussing the book, but he's credited as the monster, so I'll try to remember to call him the monster in the movie. The monster and Fritz both, and especially the monster, though their wickedness is located in their bodies, that is grounds for sympathy. So it's an argument that they can't, and especially the monster, can't help it. So that our sympathies are with the monster, as I've already mentioned, in all kinds of ways, because of Boris Karloff's performance and the close-ups on his face more than anything else. And our sympathies are with him because he can't help his abnormal brain. He can't help his violent tendencies. He can't help his brutality. His brain is abnormal, and his impulses are out of his full control. The last real question I want to draw attention to in this movie is another change from the book, and that's what is happening with the love triangle, the implied love triangle between Victor, Henry, and Elizabeth. Or Henry, Victor, and Elizabeth. The order doesn't really matter. So we have Elizabeth at the center of this love triangle. In the book, these three characters sort of still exist. As I said, Victor and Henry's names are switched, and Henry Clerval in the book is not very much like Victor Moritz in the movie. But there's no love triangle in the book at all. There's no hint of a romantic relationship between Frankenstein's friend, Victor Frankenstein's friend, and his love interest, Elizabeth. In the movie, there's not just a hint of it. It's explicit.
You know I'd go to the ends of the earth for you.
I shouldn't like that. I'm far too fond of you.
I wish you were.
Victor.
I'm sorry.
There's a subtext here that this relationship, this is not the first time Elizabeth has heard of this. He has mentioned to her before the movie begins that he desires a romantic relationship with her that she does not desire from him. And then at the end, near the end of the movie, when Henry Frankenstein goes off to chase the monster, he says to Victor,
I leave her in your care, whatever happens. You understand? In your care.
just barely shy of saying, I'm giving her to you. You can have her as your fiance, wife, girlfriend, whatever, if I don't come back. So there's a love triangle there that is not marked by jealousy. Victor and Henry have no antagonism between them because they both love Elizabeth. In fact, Henry essentially gives Elizabeth to Victor. That's problematic in all kinds of ways that I'm not going to fully address. There's more to say. But one of the things I want to draw attention, I want to just ask, what is going on there? And that leads to a question of what is going on with sex and romance through this whole movie. Because the creature, the monster, is also in the middle of this this love triangle, love square. First, one of the first things we hear is Elizabeth saying that,
The very day we announced our engagement, he told me of his experiments. He said he was on the verge of a discovery so terrific that he doubted his own sanity.
And then the central driving plot, part one of the plots is about the making of the monster, and the other one is about Henry and Elizabeth getting married. So those two things are in parallel with each other, at cross purposes with each other. On their wedding night is when the monster attacks Elizabeth, and she has been filled with bad premonitions about their wedding. And then after the attack, Henry says,
There can be no wedding while this horrible creation of mine is still alive.
the monster is in between, it has gotten in between them. And Henry literally leaves his fiancée in her bed to go pursue this male creature instead. Right? I'm going to add a little bit of biographical context by telling you that James Whale, the director of this movie, was openly gay in 1931. Very, I'm sure you know, I'm sure you can guess, this is unusual. That is, to be openly gay in the 30s was unusual, but James Whale was openly gay through his entire career. Now, I always caution against putting too much stock in biographical criticism, but I often bring up the biography of creators, of writers anyway, because on one hand, literature and film is not biography in disguise. It's not autobiography in disguise. It's not the way that the author or director tells their life story hidden and pretends that it's not. And we can't, it's not intellectually honest to say like, oh, he liked potatoes and there's a potato in this movie. It's all about himself, right? But at the same time, all the knowledge that we have is useful for helping us understand and interpret and explain a text. And part of the texture of the text is what we know about the creator and what their interests and what their biography and what their knowledge was. All of that is to say that if James Whale's sexuality is useful to us, I think it's fair to use it as a part of the knowledge that we have that helps us read and understand this movie, but we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that the movie is his life story in code. So, armed with that piece of knowledge about him, let's look back at the movie and notice how the vector of desire in the love triangle between Victor, Henry, Elizabeth is with Elizabeth in the middle connecting Victor and Henry, right? So Victor and Henry desire each other and Elizabeth is in the middle and mediates that desire. Likewise, the creature and Henry have this relationship of obsession and interest and desire in the movie, with Elizabeth situated sometimes in the middle. And Elizabeth says that the creature has come between Elizabeth and Henry. But actually, in terms of the story, it's more accurate to say that Elizabeth has come between the creature and Henry, and that's why the creature comes and visits Elizabeth in her bedroom, and then he wants to... The one that he's interested in is Henry, and he gets at Henry through Elizabeth. And Henry goes off, is interested in the creature, and goes off hunting down the creature. All of this is connected again to what we've already talked about how fear and desire are interconnected. Add to that, James Whale wasn't closeted, he was out and openly gay, but here I'm on pretty shaky speculative ground, but it is a very common gay experience to have a period of having desire that you aren't able to articulate. And in the creature, we see that represented. That the creature has these feelings that he can't articulate. He can't say them out loud. He can't express them in a way that anyone can understand. And we have this scene of the creature literally reaching out for an embrace from Henry, Frankenstein, who does not understand him, responds by pushing him away. And it's that feeling of alienation and isolation on the creature's part that is the root of the pathos through the whole film.
Sit down. Go and sit down.
We can read that pretty easily as being a dramatization of homosexual desire that isn't expressed or understood. And we can also generalize it further as an expression of interpersonal relationships of all sorts that are typified by miscommunication and misunderstandings that leads to isolation and alienation and disconnection. And that brings us back once again to the way that Henry uses the creature to escape from Elizabeth. His father says,
"Why does he go messing around an old ruined windmill when he has a decent house, a bath, good food and drink, and a darn pretty girl to come back to?"
His father articulates that Elizabeth represents the domestic life with a woman. Henry doesn't want that. Henry would rather spend his time literally with science and what he's building, but it's only a very slight push on the metaphor to say he's in an experimental phase where he's spending a lot of time with a man that he prefers to the time that he would spend with his fiancée. And his father doesn't understand why he would want that, and his father pressures him to go back and get married and have a son and live the normal life that's expected of him. And Henry wants something different for himself, but that desire appears monstrous to everyone around him. And that's kind of expressed even when he talks to Dr. Waldman. And Waldman says, "Your creature is dangerous." Waldman, in this movie, immediately reads the creature as dangerous, and Henry doesn't really deny that the creature's dangerous. He just expresses a desire.
Have you never wanted to do anything that was dangerous?
It's about what Henry wants, not about his assessment of the risks. And I think we will end there. At a couple of points in this video, you'll have noticed I said something like, "That's a long conversation that I'm just not going to have right now." You may have noticed I didn't talk at all about the fact that this movie credits the author as Mrs. Percy Shelley, or about the fact that the Boris Karloff's name isn't in the opening credits as credited as playing the monster. I didn't talk about the little introduction where someone comes out and warns us that the movie we're going to watch is really, really scary.
A man of science who sought to create a man after his own image, without reckoning upon God.
If you'd like to have any of those conversations with me, you can do so by emailing me, paul@clockworksacademy.com. You can find me on Twitter, @Dr. Moffat. Talk to me. I'd be happy to go into any of the things that I didn't go into in depth, or any things I did go into in depth if you want to engage me on any of those thoughts, give your own opinion, etc., etc., etc. If you liked this class and you would like more of this kind of thing, don't forget that I'm teaching a whole class on Frankenstein, the book, that'll start on April 15th, 2019. If you're watching this after April 15th, go to clockworksacademy.com and find out when the next course is coming, because it'll be coming eventually. Thank you so very much for joining me. I've been Dr. Paul Moffat. Goodbye.